Welcome back, everyone. This week we're diving deep into week 16 of Kevin DeYoung's Daily Doctrine. It's going to be a thought-provoking one, for sure, because we're getting into some really big questions about what it means to be human.
Yeah, no kidding. We're covering marriage, transgenderism, and the image of God. Pretty complex stuff, and definitely relevant to how we live our lives today.
For sure. So before we jump in, I'd love for you all to think about this.
Oh.
How would you define marriage? What do you think makes us uniquely human? Keep those questions in mind as we unpack DeYoung's perspective.
Sounds good. Well, he starts with marriage and jumps right into the deep end. He outlines what he sees as three essential themes: complementarity, covenant, and kids, and then Christ and the church.
Okay, so let's start with complementarity. What exactly does DeYoung mean by that term? It seems pretty central to his whole view of marriage.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's definitely not just talking about traditional gender roles, though he does affirm the concept of complementarianism. It's more that he's emphasizing how men and women in their distinct identities are uniquely suited for each other.
Right.
He sees this fittedness as being rooted all the way back in Genesis, where the woman is called a helper for the man, enabling him to fulfill that whole creation mandate to be fruitful and multiply.
That's an interesting point. It suggests that complementarity goes beyond just, you know, dividing tasks or responsibilities. It's about recognizing these inherent differences between men and women as part of God's design.
Exactly. And that leads right into his argument for monogamy and exclusivity in marriage. He points back to the creation account again, where the woman is taken from the man and named in relation to him. This one flesh union, as he calls it, is like a reunion almost, a coming together of two parts that were originally one.
Hmm. That's a beautiful way to think about it. It's like marriage isn't just some random social construct, but something woven into the very fabric of creation.
Right. Now, his second theme, covenant and kids, might raise some eyebrows, but it's super important to understanding his overall argument. Drawing from Malachi, he emphasizes that marriage is more than just a romantic partnership. It's a covenant bond, established by a verbal oath and a physical sign, sexual intercourse. And one of the key purposes of this bond, according to DeYoung, is the potential for godly offspring.
So he's pretty clear that procreation is an integral part of God's design for marriage. Not the only purpose, of course, but definitely a defining factor.
Yeah, and he's careful to clarify that this doesn't mean sex is solely for procreation or that every marriage must produce children. But he firmly believes that you can't truly define marriage without acknowledging this inherent potential for offspring. He even cites sources from various Christian traditions, the Westminster Confession, the Book of Common Prayer, and Humana Vitae, to back up this view.
It seems like he's trying to establish a really solid theological foundation for his understanding of marriage, drawing on all these different historical and denominational perspectives.
For sure. And to complete his view on marriage, he turns to Ephesians 5 and that theme of Christ and the church. He sees this profound parallel between the union of a man and a woman and the mystical union of Christ and his bride, the church.
I'm curious to hear more about that. How does he connect those two seemingly different unions?
Well, he argues that the one flesh union of marriage reflects this profound spiritual union between Christ and the church. And for this analogy to work, he emphasizes that there has to be a differentiation within the marital union itself, reflecting the distinct roles of Christ and the church.
So he's saying that the very structure of marriage points to something much larger, like a divine reality that transcends our earthly understanding.
Exactly. And he even brings in that imagery from Revelation, specifically the marriage supper of the Lamb and the coming together of heaven and earth, to further solidify this connection. For DeYoung, marriage isn't just a social contract. It's this profound reflection of God's design for humanity and the ultimate union we're all moving towards.
That's a powerful image to consider. It definitely elevates the concept of marriage beyond just a purely human institution.
And this understanding of marriage as rooted in God's design kind of lays the groundwork for his discussion of transgenderism, a topic that's often, fraught with emotion and differing opinions.
It's definitely a complex and sensitive issue. How does DeYoung approach it from a biblical perspective?
He starts by reaffirming that fundamental biblical teaching that God created humanity as male and female, and believes we are called to live in accordance with our biological sex, regardless of our feelings or internal sense of gender identity.
He's not shying away from stating his position clearly, that's for sure. What biblical basis does he provide for this stance?
He points to Genesis 1:27, where God creates that first human pair, male and female, in his image. He emphasizes the unique helper role of the woman in relation to the man, suggesting that this inherent difference isn't a cultural construct, but a fundamental aspect of God's creational plan.
Okay, so he's drawing a direct line from the very beginning of creation to establish the significance of biological sex as this foundational element of human identity.
Exactly. And he does address the existence of intersex individuals, acknowledging it as a real phenomenon, but views it as a medical anomaly resulting from the fallen state of the world rather than a challenge to the created order.
That's an important distinction to make. So how does he suggest Christians should respond to those who experience transgender inclinations or identify as transgender?
He urges Christians to approach this issue with a combination of truth and compassion, stressing the importance of patience, kindness, and understanding in our interactions with those who identify as transgender. However, he also makes a clear distinction. Acknowledging someone's feelings doesn't mean we affirm their actions.
That seems like a nuanced approach. It acknowledges the complexity of the issue while still holding to a clear biblical standard.
Right. He compares it to other areas where Christians are called to deny themselves, like struggling with eating disorders or resisting the temptation to divorce in unbiblical circumstances.
So he's essentially saying that our feelings don't always align with God's design, and following Christ sometimes involves submitting our desires to his will.
That's the heart of it. He believes that true freedom comes from aligning our lives with God's truth, even when it's difficult or goes against cultural trends. And to further clarify his stance, he dives deeper into the biblical basis for his view, arguing that Scripture teaches this organic unity between biological sex and gender identity.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
What specific passages does he reference to support that view?
So he points to the fact that only male and female can reproduce, citing Genesis 1.28 and 2.2 as evidence. He also discusses the biblical prohibitions against homosexuality found in Leviticus 18.22 and Romans 1.2627.
Those are definitely passages that spark a lot of debate and interpretation. How does DeYoung interpret them in relation to transgenderism?
He argues that these passages only make sense if we accept the equivalence of biological sex and corresponding gender identity. If we separate the two, he believes the biblical prohibitions kind of lose their grounding.
So for DeYoung, the male-female binary isn't just a cultural norm. It's an essential part of God's created order. And any blurring or confusion of those lines, according to his interpretation, is contrary to God's design.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from that conclusion. He even references passages like Deuteronomy 22.5, which speaks against men dressing as women, and 1 Corinthians 11.114-15, which addresses the disgrace associated with gender-bending expressions.
So he's pulling from both Old and New Testament passages to build his case. It seems like he's trying to demonstrate this consistent biblical witness on the issue.
And he brings it all together with this powerful statement. He says, we don't have an inherent right to do whatever we want with our bodies. We belong to God, and our bodies are meant to glorify him.
It's a call to stewardship, isn't it? Recognizing that we're not the ultimate owners of our physical selves.
Yeah, exactly. And from this in-depth exploration of marriage and transgenderism, he seamlessly transitions to the concept of the image of God, or as theologians call it, the imago Dei.
Ah, the imago Dei, a concept that's fascinated theologians for centuries. How does DeYoung approach this foundational doctrine?
He starts by reminding us of a core truth. Every human being, without exception, is made in God's image. This isn't a privilege earned through good behavior or a status achieved through certain accomplishments. It's an inherent dignity bestowed upon all humanity.
It's a powerful statement. Has huge implications for how we view ourselves and others. Where does he go from there?
Well, he points to the intentional repetition of the imago Dei concept in those opening chapters of Genesis. It appears at creation, after the fall, and after the flood. This repeated emphasis, DeYoung argues, highlights the enduring nature of the imago Dei. It's not something we lose because of sin or any other event. It's woven into our very being.
That's interesting. So even though humanity has fallen into sin, this essential image of God within us remains intact.
That's his point. And he doesn't stop with the Old Testament. He also brings in New Testament references to the image of God, specifically 1 Corinthians 11.7 and James 3.9.
That James passage is a good reminder that even those we might consider our enemies bear the image of God. It's like a call to radical respect and dignity, regardless of differences in belief or behavior.
Absolutely. And DeYoung highlights two important shifts in how the New Testament talks about the imago Dei. First, he observes a shift in focus towards Christ as the perfect embodiment of the image of God.
We see this in passages like 2 Corinthians 4.4-6 and Colossians 1.15-20, where Christ is described as the image of the invisible God.
Right. The second shift he points out is towards viewing the imago Dei as something we are moving toward, like a future destination rather than just a present reality.
So we're both bearers of the image of God now, and we're also in the process of becoming more fully conformed to that image.
Exactly. We see this in passages like Romans 8:29, where Paul talks about us being conformed to the image of his Son, and 1 Corinthians 15:49, where we're told that we will bear the image of the heavenly man. So the Imago Dei is both our present reality and our future hope.
That's beautiful. But what does it actually mean to be made in the image of God? Like, what are the practical implications of this doctrine?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And DeYoung tackles it head-on. He contrasts the views of older theologians who emphasize the structural aspects of the Imago Dei, things like our intelligence and rationality, with more recent theologians who focus on the functional aspects, our ethics and actions.
So is it about who we are or what we do, or a combination of both?
He sees value in both perspectives, but he leans towards emphasizing the functional aspect, drawing from those New Testament passages about being conformed to the image of Christ.
So it's about becoming more like Christ in our character and actions.
That's a key takeaway. And he outlines 3 dimensions of how we live out this image of God: as God's representatives on earth, as beings in relationship with God, and as reflectors of God's righteousness.
Let's break those down a bit. What does he mean by representing God?
He highlights the unique role of humans in creation. We're called to rule and steward the earth, reflecting God's dominion over all things. This sets us apart from animals and gives us this profound responsibility.
It's like we're God's ambassadors,
Yeah.
entrusted with caring for his creation.
Exactly. And then he moves to that relational aspect, emphasizing that humans were created for covenant with God. Unlike any other creature, we have the capacity to know, serve, and worship our Creator. This relationship is central to our identity and purpose.
That's a pretty profound thought. We're wired for connection with the divine.
And finally, DeYoung addresses the image of God as a reflection of God's righteousness. He draws from Ephesians 4:24 and Colossians 3:9 to 10 to explain that while sin has distorted our reflection of God's image, we can be renewed in Christ-likeness and increasingly reflect his character.
So it's not about achieving perfect moral behavior, but about this process of transformation through Christ.
Right. We're becoming more like Christ as we grow in our relationship with him. And this leads to a crucial point. We can't fully grasp what it means to be made in God's image without looking to Christ.
He's the ultimate model of what it means to be truly human.
Exactly. DeYoung reminds us that the gospel is all about the glory of Christ, who perfectly embodies the image of God. And through the transforming power of the Holy Spirit, we are being conformed to that same image, becoming more like Christ in every way.
That's a beautiful and challenging concept.
Yeah.
So how does this doctrine of the Imago Dei play out in our everyday lives? What are the practical implications?
Well, that's what we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive. DeYoung provides some really specific examples of how the Imago Dei should shape our actions, our relationships, and our interaction with the world around us.
Well, I'm definitely eager to hear more. This has been a fascinating exploration of DeYoung's thoughts on these essential topics. Stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into Week 16 of Daily Doctrine.
Picking up where we left off, DeYoung doesn't just leave us with this, abstract idea of the Imago Dei. He goes on to outline 6 specific ways this concept should impact our lives.
6 implications of the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first area where he sees it playing out?
He starts by reiterating the unique position of human beings within God's creation. We're not just, highly evolved animals. We bear the very image of the Creator. That sets us fundamentally apart.
Right, so it's about recognizing that inherent dignity that comes with being made in God's image.
Exactly. He even brings in Psalm 8.5, where humanity is described as being a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned with glory and honor. DeYoung argues that the pinnacle of creation isn't some majestic mountain or a brilliant star, but humanity itself bearing the imprint of God.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It shifts our perspective from seeing ourselves as just another species to recognizing our unique place in the grand scheme of things.
And that leads right into his second implication, the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. He connects this directly to the issue of abortion, arguing that personhood isn't determined by size or level of development or environment or degree of dependence on another person.
Like a powerful argument against the idea that a fetus is somehow less than human. He's making a case for the sanctity of life from the moment of conception.
Right. DeYoung is saying that from the very beginning, a human being bears God's image and deserves protection. And he doesn't stop there. He extends this principle to other, life and death issues as well.
That's right. He argues that this same principle should apply to things like euthanasia and the treatment of the elderly and those with disabilities. It's about this consistent ethic of life that values every person regardless of their circumstances.
It's a challenging call, no doubt, to uphold the dignity of every human life, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. But DeYoung sees it as a non-negotiable consequence of believing in the Imago Dei.
So the Imago Dei isn't just a theological concept. It has real-world implications for how we treat the most vulnerable among us.
Now, moving on to his third implication, DeYoung argues that the Imago Dei provides the true framework for understanding what it means to be fully human. He pushes back against the idea that our identity is solely about self-expression or fulfilling our desires.
It's a timely message in a culture that often equates freedom with doing whatever feels good or following your heart, regardless of the consequences.
Right. He reminds us that true human flourishing comes from aligning our lives with God's design and seeking to reflect his character in the world. This echoes back to his earlier discussion of marriage and transgenderism, where he emphasized the importance of submitting our desires to God's will.
He's consistent in his belief that true freedom is found in obedience to God, not in unrestrained self-indulgence.
And he drives this point home with a fascinating observation about Adam and Eve in the garden. They were already made in God's image, already reflecting his likeness, even before the serpent tempted them with the promise of becoming more like God.
It's almost like they were tricked into believing they needed something more when they already possessed the greatest gift, the image of God within them.
That's a really profound insight. DeYoung is highlighting that subtle deception at the heart of the fall. It wasn't about humans striving for something they lacked, but rather a distortion of something they already possess.
They were lured into believing that true fulfillment lay in grasping for something outside of God's design, when in reality, everything they needed was already present in their relationship with him.
Right. This then leads to DeYoung's fourth implication. The world belongs to God. He uses this striking analogy to illustrate this point. He compares our presence on earth to the statues ancient kings would erect throughout their kingdoms to symbolize their ownership.
It's a vivid image. Just like those statues marked a territory as belonging to a king, our presence as God's image bearers on earth signifies that this is his domain. We are guests in his house, so to speak.
Right. And this has huge implications for how we view our role in creation. We're not just here to exploit the earth for our own gain. We're called to be stewards, caring for God's creation and reflecting his glory through our actions.
It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to care for the environment and use the resources we've been given wisely, not recklessly.
Now, building on this idea of God's ownership, DeYoung brings us to his fifth implication. We belong to God. He uses a familiar story from the Gospels to illustrate this point, Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees about paying taxes.
Oh, yeah. That classic scene where the Pharisees try to trap Jesus with a tricky question about taxes and end up getting a lesson in true allegiance.
Remember, they were trying to catch Jesus in a contradiction by asking whether it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus masterfully outsmarts them by asking whose image is on the denarius.
And of course they answer Caesar's, to which Jesus famously replies, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." What a brilliant response.
DeYoung uses the story to highlight a crucial truth. While we have earthly obligations and responsibilities, our ultimate allegiance belongs to God.
It's a reminder that our lives are not our own. We were bought with a price, and we belong to the one who created and redeemed us.
And finally, DeYoung concludes his exploration of the Imago Dei with the sixth implication. This doctrine teaches us how to truly worship. He takes us back to the Old Testament and the strict prohibition against making graven images.
That's a fascinating connection. What's the link between the Imago Dei and the prohibition against idols?
Well, DeYoung explains that this prohibition stemmed from the fact that God is invisible and cannot be fully captured in any physical representation. But then in the fullness of time, God took on human form in Jesus Christ.
So in a sense, Jesus becomes the ultimate image of God, the perfect representation of the invisible God.
Exactly. And because of this, our worship is no longer directed towards idols or vague notions of the divine. It's centered on the person of Jesus Christ, who makes the invisible God visible to us. He is the one we adore, the one we follow, the one we strive to imitate.
DeYoung has taken this lofty theological concept of the Imago Dei and made it incredibly practical. It's not just an abstract idea. It shapes how we view ourselves, how we treat others, how we interact with the world around us, and ultimately how we worship.
Yeah, he's shown us that the Imago Dei is a transformative truth that should permeate every aspect of our lives.
So much richness packed into one concept. I'm eager to see how he brings all of these ideas together in the final part of his reflection.
As we wrap up our deep dive into week 16 of DeYoung's Daily Doctrine, let's come back to that central question. If we are indeed made in the image of God, what does that mean for us, like practically? How should this truth shape our everyday lives?
It's easy to get lost in the theological weeds, but I think that's the crucial question, right? How does this doctrine translate into tangible action?
And DeYoung definitely doesn't shy away from those implications. He challenges us to consider how the Imago Dei should impact everything from our personal choices to our social interactions to our engagement with the world around us.
So it's not just about having the right understanding, you know?
Yeah.
It's about letting it transform our lives from the inside out.
Yeah, exactly. For example, he argues that if we truly believe that every human being bears God's image, it radically changes how we approach issues like abortion, euthanasia, racism, even how we treat those who hold different beliefs or opinions than our own.
Wow, that's a pretty broad scope. It's not just about individual morality. It's
No.
about shaping our entire worldview and how we engage with society as a whole.
Right. He's suggesting that the Imago Dei becomes this like foundational principle that guides our ethical decision making. It's not about imposing our own moral code on others, but rather about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every person, regardless of their circumstances, beliefs, or actions.
It's a call to radical empathy and compassion, even when it's challenging or uncomfortable.
Definitely. DeYoung also challenges us to think about how the Imago Dei should shape our understanding of what it means to be human. It's not just about pursuing our own happiness or self-fulfillment. It's about reflecting God's character in the world through our actions and interactions.
So it's less about self-actualization and more about becoming more like Christ in our character and conduct.
Right, and that reflection can take many forms. Acts of love, compassion, justice, creativity, even the way we approach our work. It's about recognizing that every aspect of our lives can be an expression of the image of God within us.
That's a beautiful thought. It gives a sense of purpose and meaning to even the most mundane tasks.
And ultimately, DeYoung reminds us that the Imago Dei points us to our ultimate purpose, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. It's about finding our true fulfillment in a right relationship with the one who created us in His image.
It all comes back to that core relationship with God. It's the foundation for everything else.
Exactly. And that brings us full circle to that idea of Christ as the perfect embodiment of the Imago Dei. We see in Jesus what it truly means to be human, to live in perfect harmony with God's will, and to reflect His glory in every aspect of life.
He's the ultimate model of what it looks like to live out the Imago Dei.
As we conclude our deep dive into week 16 of Daily Doctrine, the challenge for all of us is to move beyond simply understanding this concept intellectually and to allow it to permeate our hearts, our minds, and ultimately our actions.
It's about letting the truth of the Imago Dei sink deep into our souls and shape everything we do. It's about seeing ourselves and others through the lens of God's love and grace.
Yeah, it's a journey that leads to a deeper understanding of who we are, who God is, and what it truly means to live a life that reflects His glory.
Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Kevin DeYoung's Daily Doctrine for this week. We've covered some really profound territory, but there's always more to explore. Keep wrestling with these ideas, asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep seeking to live out the truth of the Imago Dei in your own unique way.
Until next time, keep diving deep.